5 nations, including the Penobscot Nation, Passamaquoddy, Milliset, Micmac, and Abenaki. And I was thinking as we were coming together today, the importance of thinking about, being raised on this stolen land here in Maine and how much that relates to how we want to very carefully think about data collection efforts, knowing that historically and today, oftentimes data is also stolen from communities and from peoples. So I'm hoping today that we can center this concept of data collection being about healing, being about power sharing, and being focused on accountability to the diverse populations that we serve, that we partner with, and that we work beside. So that's what I'm hoping that we can do today. I have a little outline of our agenda I wanted to share with you. I'm first gonna actually share some of the results from the skills inventory that folks completed before the session, then review some key elements for success. Then we're going to talk about the important role of matching community needs and organizational needs to the skills, and also with the methods you use for your data collection. We are going to take a break at 12:40 for 5 minutes. And then we're going to be coming back and then going into some small groups to do some discussions about organizational capacity. Then I'm going to talk a bit about using interview and focus group guides and protocols to build these meaningful conversations. Then we're going to have some time together to look at some of the elements that are recommended for developing your plan moving forward, and then close up with some group discussion and thoughts about the next steps that you can take. So thank you to the folks that were able to fill out the skills inventory survey. And for those that weren't able to do that prior to, I'm going to share that document of the survey in the chat here in a moment, so that you can have that. I actually use this inventory throughout the process because my skills and capacity change over time. So that may be also true for all of you. So I want to point out a few things that stood out from those that were able to complete it. When folks were asked to rate the things that they truly enjoyed or excelled at, there were a few things related to communication that came up. Folks, and this was at least half of the group responding said that they excelled and were comfortable at providing accurate information when communicating. That active listening came up and again with folks, which makes sense that you've all had training around active listening skills. Being able to be consistent in communicating came up, and also folks said that they really felt they excelled about being able to be relaxed coming into conversations. One key thing that stood out was folks sharing that they are able to really do a good job at keeping people involved in conversations, which is critical for the data collection efforts that we're going to be talking about. And then when we get to look at how we start getting into data analysis, many folks mentioned that they can quickly synthesize information, that they can debrief complex issues, and they can identify themes, which are critical for this type of data analysis. And then when I looked through the results of the survey, there were a lot of people, over 70% of people, and at sometimes 80% shared that they were confident in the following skills: making people feel comfortable, being empathetic, that folks are confident that they are mentally and physically ready to facilitate. So that is fantastic. That is a key to success in this area. And not surprisingly, the majority of folks said that they were confident in the topic of sexual violence and also with understanding trauma. So there are a few things that came up that folks said that they would like to develop more. The first thing that came up was being comfortable with lack of control. I relate to this. I relate to this when my internet's a little bit unstable and I have to turn off my video and I can't visually connect with folks. I'm going to share some tools that I use in my preparation that help me be more comfortable in being out of control of these data collection opportunities, because they are very dynamic and you often need to change direction in those. So we'll talk about those tools. The second thing that came up was managing time. This is often a challenge. I'm going to talk about some strategies to help with this, which is about not doing this work alone and doing a lot of practice with folks. And then wanting to improve and develop data analysis skills were also brought up. I'm going to share a little bit about the prep work that can help in making the data analysis a little bit smoother, a few tips, and then share some resources to get more instruction and training around data analysis. So that's a little bit of what I learned. I am going to go ahead and share the link to the skills inventory in the chat right now. And I would invite folks to go ahead, and you're welcome to save that to your own files and come back to it at a later date. If you weren't able to fill it out already, you're welcome to take some time to do that after our session today. For folks that were able to go through, I'm wondering if there was anything that stood out to you or was surprising when you filled out the survey. And I just invite folks, as I start talking a little bit more about some of the setup and keys to success, I invite you to share some of that in the chat. So when we talk about key elements for success, for setting up these data collection methods that are focused on building partnership, building community, and building connections for folks, there are three areas I like to think about. First is the what, second is the why, and third is the how. So when we're looking at the why, the number one thing is to be very clear about your purpose. I want to say that all of these data collection methods impact relationships. They can help build relationships, or they could actually cause harm to relationships if they are not organized and managed in a thoughtful and meaningful way. So while that may not be your purpose in the data collection, it will be an outcome. So always think about that when you're thinking about your purpose. And then, of course, as you've been doing some of the beginning elements of the community assessment work, really being able to think through, what is it that you hope to learn? And lastly, what will be done with the information generated? I think one of the key elements to connect this data collection work to our community building and our relationship building efforts is there really needs to be the capacity in place and a plan in place to act on the information that's gathered. For a lot of people, for a lot of staff at our organizations, for a lot of community members, they are over surveyed. They are often asked for information and don't always get to see what meaningful impact that has. Sometimes information's gathered, it's kept in a binder or on a folder on a computer and not put into action. So being really clear about how you're going to use the information so that you can be able to talk to people about that goal and purpose, to make sure they're able to be part of that and help you really carry it through to the change efforts that you're looking at. Connected, obviously, to this is finding out what's important to your community, to your partners, and to your organization. It might be that you might have connections in the community. You might have partners that have similar interests, that you can be collaborating and doing some data collection jointly. That's a win-win situation that will help build more support. So really wanting to tie your work to the priorities coming from the community, or if you're looking at doing internal assessment work, that you're prioritizing the needs of staff within the organization and what they want to focus on and improve on. When we look at how, the number one thing I start with is, am I using a trauma-informed approach to that? Absolutely connected to this is the approach culturally responsive and culturally relevant to the community of people that I am looking to have these conversations with? And then we've got to play that matching game. Does the method match our goals? Will it help us actually answer the questions that we have? And does the method match up with the capacity that my team has and that we have in the community? So when I say that our data collection efforts need to be trauma informed, what are the first things that come to mind for people? And please feel free to share in the chat, even just the first word that comes to mind when you think of trauma informed data collection. And don't be shy. I don't mind a fast moving chat option. And folks from the coalition offered to help me to make sure that I don't lose track of anything. Survivor-centered, excellent, yes. So some ways that things can be survivor-centered is that it puts their needs and experiences first, right? That it is voluntary. I see that folks are sharing in the chat, recognizing how clients experience our services, being considerate, being mindful of the experiences seen and unseen. Oh, George, I really like that you shared both the seen and unseen. Thank you for that. And Ashley, yes, ensuring collaboration with all communities. These are great. I'm going to share a few things specifically that I think come up when we're looking at focus groups and interviews and surveys. First of all, having trained folks that are being the facilitators or interviews that can monitor and address participant feelings as they come up during the process. Folks mentioned in the skills inventory that they felt really strong about their ability to build rapport. And that is critical to a trauma-informed approach to doing data collection. Being able to pause, to reflect, and give participants time in the process is really critical. Another thing that is critical is understanding your role in acting as a facilitator or interviewer is going to be different than other roles you might have as a direct services provider. So respecting that role definition and being able to bring in individuals that can be those support people for direct service needs. I think providing immediate access to support people is really important. And not only providing that to people who might express some emotional distress, but to everyone, because we all know that trauma shows up differently for people. Some people might become quiet or reserved, and others might want to talk more about the impact in a group setting. So making sure we have those things in place. Great. Maria brought up language access and culturally relevant materials and approaches being critical. Yes, I'm going to talk about that more when we get into methods, especially. You want people to be able to show up as their authentic selves. So that means that the space needs to be set up for all of the linguistic and cultural needs that folks have. Being mindful of privileges and oppression as well as biases. Yes, we're going to talk too about some ways that you can have some checks and balances about your biases you're bringing into the process and how you can work within a team concept to address that and lessen the chance for bias. A few other things I'll say around here. I mentioned about making sure that all participation is voluntary, and also that there are regular times for folks to opt in or opt out throughout the process, that it's a constant checking in, that there are multiple decision points throughout a survey or interview. This could be something like saying, now I would like to ask you some questions about this topic, whatever that might be, and then check in and say, do you want to continue and talk about that topic with me? Another key thing in this area is being transparent when describing what folks will be asked to do and talk about. Something that's becoming a part of my regular practice is actually providing people interview questions prior to an interview and prior to focus groups. I think as we've all, a lot of us have moved these type of efforts to Zoom and other virtual platforms, and we haven't been able to build rapport in person with folks before doing recruitment efforts. Necessarily, sometimes we might have long-term existing relationships, but when I haven't had that, I've found that especially right now, it's been important to be as transparent as possible and provide my questions to folks in advance so that they can feel some safety, and also know that it's this trusting relationship where we're going to share information with each other throughout the process. Great, let's see. I think there was a few things I wanted to talk about how we develop our interview questions, is that we also need to use that as an opportunity for building rapport. I'll talk a little bit about later, kind of the ordering of questions and how that fits for being trauma informed. We obviously need to be looking at language and not using jargon, and thinking about and talking with community members prior to even looking at data collection about what language is meaningful for folks and how they identify issues themselves, and being able to use that terminology when you're doing your focus groups or surveys. Having participants be involved in developing surveys, interview questions, being partners in facilitating focus groups can be really critical ways to build shared ownership of the information and really empower community members or staff or whoever it might be that you're engaging for these discussions to be invested in the process and trust the process. We also need to be thinking about trauma and trauma responses when it comes to those that are doing the interviewing or facilitation. We need to make sure that we're well prepared in an interview, that we have a good working knowledge of the systems, but also that we've got all the support we need around us. We need to make sure that folks are able to engage with people of different backgrounds, to be empathetic and non-judgmental, and be able to navigate that role conflict in their position. In that your role in this data collection role, this interviewer, facilitator, is often to remain as neutral as possible while being empathetic. So not engaging folks in a counseling role, but you can still be in a helping role in some way if you're bringing in that support and partnership. And this was mentioned in the survey. Being able to build in time for reflection and debriefing is really important for everyone involved in the process. Interviewers and those that are doing the data analysis can experience secondary trauma with repeated exposure to these topics. So really being mindful and thoughtful about that and talking about that with your team. Of course, confidentiality is critical, and being able to do follow-up, whether that be follow-up resources for participants, and again, making sure they're offered to everyone. When we're looking at culturally responsive and relevant data collection efforts that many people mentioned in the chat, I often go to this tool that was developed to focus on culturally responsive research methods, but I really find that the concepts that were developed by Chicago Beyond, and here is a graphic from their tool. I'm going to share the information in the chat from their guide. Why am I always being researched is what it's called. And it identifies 7 inequities that are held in place by power and 7 opportunities for change when we're looking at data collection efforts. And what I would offer for folks to think about is look at what and whose values and perspectives are being represented in your plan for your data collection. And is this design you're putting together appropriate to both the cultural context and the values of the community, the organization, or the partners that you're working with? So when we think a little bit more about what methods are going to give you the richest data, I want to talk through some core methods. And as I said, I was involved in the original sexual assault demonstration initiative. A lot of this information is being pulled and adapted from the Listening to Our Communities toolkit that we developed for the National SADI project. And I'll share that link. I think that folks have had some exposure to this, or may have actually, there have been some tools that have been adapted for the New York State context. So I'll be pointing you back to this as where I'm pulling some of my information. Yes, and I can also, to Sarah, just send you my resource list too, if that helps you out. But yes, I don't
Thanks
want
so
folks to
much.
think that they have to try to bookmark and save all the links I'm sharing, but I'm sure that we do have some folks on the line that do like to jump in and take a look at things while we're in the midst of discussion. So first I want to talk a little bit about surveys. I love food. And so I'm going to talk with some metaphors related to food when I talk about these data collection efforts. If they don't resonate for you, I apologize. I will take your suggestions of other metaphors and things that resonate for you. When I think about surveys, kind of at times I start to think about Yelp reviews for restaurants, right? These surveys can gather information about knowledge, attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. I love surveys. I use them all the time. They are inexpensive. It's something that you can administer in a consistent way. They can offer more privacy, and they're a heck of a lot easier to analyze results, especially if you're collecting information through online surveys these days. There are some cons and some challenges with surveys. Designing quality surveys is really a complex science, not only in how you order your questions, how you ask your questions, how you organize the layout of their questions. They all impact the effectiveness of the data that you're getting back. Also, we have to be mindful that behaviors would all be self-reported in surveys, which is okay, but may not always show the full picture. It's also hard to get those really rich stories from surveys. Accessibility can be a challenge, especially if you're looking at multilingual access needs and being able to translate questions into a variety of different surveys. And also surveys can be triggering for folks. And if you're not in the space with them as they're completing the survey, you might not be able to provide access to support services and follow-up care in a timely manner. So those are some initial thoughts about surveys. I'm not sure how many folks might be thinking about surveys as being a component of your process. But I imagine, and from hearing from Joanne, it looks like interviews might be on the plate for many of you. And when I think of in-depth interviews, I think about sitting down for tea with some of my favorite people and having those deep conversations. When you're doing this, you can be assessing attitudes, opinions, interpretations, motives, and experiences. You can be detailed and gather in-depth information in only just a few questions sometimes. You can also ensure that participants are interpreting the questions in the way that were intended, because you can do follow-up with them. It also gives you a little bit more flexibility to explore and ask for more examples from folks when they share information. And I will be sharing the slides too. If folks are worried about having to take notes, you will also get these slides. So please just be you and be focused. If note-taking helps you today, go for it. If it doesn't, just know that you'll get these after the fact. One thing to put out there related to interviews is that they are time intensive. Being consistent across interviews can be challenging, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. How to interpret the interviews is not always self-evident. Things might come up that were surprising, or you may need more context to help you do your analysis. It definitely requires good interviewing skills, which it sounds like many of you are coming into that with having good active listening and good facilitation skills, whether you're a trainer or if you're doing direct service work, you're already set up to have great skills around this. And then I'm going to talk about focus groups. So focus groups are really group interviews, right? And for me, when I think about them, I think about getting a pizza and gathering with folks and bouncing ideas off of each other. So with these focus groups, you're able to collect information about attitudes, opinions, but also interpretations. So that's a key thing for you to think about if you're looking to get information more in depth about how people are interpreting information or situations. Focus groups are going to be a great tool for you. Similar to interviews, you can get really in depth with your focus groups. The discussion can lead to insights that you wouldn't get from individuals because people interact with each other, and one participant might bring up something else that makes someone think of a related issue, and things can build. They're also relatively low cost and low time investment. You might be able to gather information from 8 people all at once, and it might be an hour and a half, as opposed to if you did interviews with them, that might be 8 to 10 hours that you are expending on the interview process. A few things to think about for challenges. It can be really hard to assemble a group. People's lives are busy. Scheduling can be really hard. So it does take some finesse in organizing a focus group. Results will be influenced by group dynamics, by design. Focus groups are not set up to be consensus building opportunities. It's to give you some rich data on a topic, and there will be interplay in between the group members. You've got to be a really good group facilitator and have those facilitation skills ready for either when a conversation might not be building and you need to be able to encourage folks to participate, or it might be a really lively discussion and it might get a little off track and you need to bring it back to the goals of the group. And similar to interviews, it can sometimes be hard to interpret what folks share when you're doing the data analysis. But I'll talk about some tools later that will help us think through how we can deal with some of those challenges. I also want to bring up Photovoice. Photovoice has been around for a long time. It is used in many, many different fields, and we're starting to use it more in the sexual assault prevention field specifically. It uses video and or photo images to capture aspects of community members, their environment, and their experiences. When I, again, think of my food metaphors, to me, this is like getting that video instructional guide of how to make a recipe, where I get to hear about all the ingredients. It's even better if it might be a live demonstration too, but typically you're capturing video or photos or art in some cases. There are immediate rewards for participants in participating. It's a way to bring creative and fun elements into your data collection methods. I will say that I also think that interviews and focus groups can have fun and creative methods as well. But one thing that's really unique to a Photovoice approach is that images can often be understood regardless of language, culture, or other factors. Some things translate across cultures and languages. There's also an immediate product that can be used for advocacy and policy work and organizational change work immediately. Instead of going back and doing data analysis, the data is visually in front of you right away. Some things to think about if you're looking at doing a creative approach to your data collection is that these are meant to be participatory, collaborative process from the absolute beginning. It does require some training. The participants will need some support. It might be that they need tools to or equipment for shooting videos or taking photographs. It's really key that these type of projects result in a very specific action. It does take some time and resources. I am going to share some of my favorite tools around Photovoice. I'm going to share a webinar. I'm going to share a piece from the community toolbox that's more of a how-to. And then I also want to share an example from the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence related to how they used Photovoice. Oops, sorry. I'm going to repost the community toolbox link for you shortly. I think I missed the hyperlink there. But in Indiana, they use Photovoice for a prevention project working with individuals with developmental disabilities. And the link here is outlining their process and procedure. It's called Sidewalks to Sexual Violence Prevention. And I think it's a very powerful example of how doing community needs assessment in a way that's culturally appropriate really allowed this community to not only listen to individuals with disabilities, but help them to lead the efforts to create a more accessible community for them. So if you have the time, feel free to take a look at that guide. We also did a short podcast on the topic as well that folks could take a look at. Are there any questions about any of those methods before we take a 5-minute break? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat, so I would invite folks to take a minute to step away from your computer, grab a snack, grab a drink, and we will start back up at 1 p.m. Hi, folks. I misspoke earlier and said 1 when I meant to say 12:50. I'm not sure if we might have folks that might be off doing their wonderful break until 1. But Sarah or Joanne, do you think I should start back up or should I wait a little longer?
Maybe if folks are here, could they maybe give a thumbs up to give us a sense of how many folks are still here? Seeing a bunch of thumbs up. Joanne, what was that, about half people?
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Well, why don't I see if while folks were on break, if any questions popped up for them. And we'll take a few questions now, and then hopefully folks will be back. So if any questions popped up or any reactions or thoughts about what data collection methods do you think you might be using in your work ahead?
And Sally, you're fine with folks unmuting themselves if they'd rather ask it that way. Yes.
Yes, Sarah, thank you for that.
Yes.
Yep, you're welcome to unmute and share your thoughts or ideas about what data collection methods you want to use.
We've had George Kilpatrick, House, he, him, his. We've had a good success in our program using the focus group method, and that seems to have worked for us. And the good thing is we had a trained facilitator and researcher to do that for us. Yes. So the challenge for us would be, the design instrument actually doing that for ourselves. But that's the method that we have used the most successfully to do the research and evaluation for our efforts. The surveys have been difficult to get retention on, unfortunately, but I suspect that we'll use focus groups because I like the interaction or the perceived interaction. I mean, we didn't do them directly. We had other folks, our researchers, do them, but I kind of like that method.
Oh, I do too. Focus groups, I find just so invigorating and fascinating and helpful. So I'm glad to hear that you have been using them in the past. And thank you for bringing up that some people often have a person external to their organization facilitate focus groups or design and facilitate focus groups for them. And that is fine. And it works really well for a lot of people. I'm just here to say, I think you all can do it yourselves too. Like I know you have the skills and the abilities, and what a great learning opportunity if you've been able to watch someone who maybe does that as their core work is facilitating focus groups, that you're able to watch and see how it worked for them and then pick up maybe some tools for them. That's certainly how I learned. I watched a lot of people do it. I worked in partnership with consultants or researchers, and then learned enough where I felt like I could do it on my, well, not on my own. I won't say that. I can't do it on my own, but I can coordinate an effort with a team now. Yeah. Laura, do you have a question? I see your hand up.
Yes, I do. And I apologize that my camera is off. I'm driving. But do you feel like focus groups could work virtually, since we're kind of all stuck in the limbo between virtual meetings and in person? Do you feel like virtual Zoom focus groups would be just as efficient, or?
I do. And you know what I'm experiencing and hearing from folks is they're actually working better than some of our traditional methods. I think right now, and this might change as as it's safer for folks to gather in person, and things are opening up around the country, but a lot of people have become comfortable with using Zoom and other virtual formats. And there is a nice give and take using a virtual platform where you can interact with people and see each other. You can also use some of the interactive options within Zoom. You could actually do some polling, so you could combine some standard focus group techniques with some polling if you wanted some more quantitative information. So you definitely can do it. The biggest things you need to be thinking about are accessibility issues. What tools do people have access to, and how can you work to create privacy and confidentiality, especially if folks might be participating from a space that they share with other people. So those are just some things to work out through the recruitment process. One thing that we've been doing is actually doing practice meetups with folks before the actual focus group, so that we can check out the technology. We can talk about who will be in that space, how they can make it as private as possible. So yes, I think it's something that we can look to do, and a lot of people have had success with it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Great questions. Any other thoughts? Oh, and it looks like George said that the last focus group that they did was virtual. So George, yeah, if you want to throw any tips that you all used to make those accessible spaces in the chat, that would be lovely.
Well, once again, we didn't do it, but it was done for us. And then the data was brought back to us. So us doing it ourselves will be a new thing for us.
Well, like I said, I think you'll be up to the challenge. Well, I think where we're gonna head now, I think most folks are back with us. We started off our time together talking about your individual skill sets that you're bringing to this work. Now we want to take some time and look a little bit at your organizational capacity, because if there's one thing you can remember from our time together today, it is my plea to you to not try to do this work alone. I don't think that is good for you as a human being, and I don't think that will be good for you, for the participants, the community members, or the staff that you might be looking to engage in some type of data collection efforts. That this is better when done in partnership with folks, or best case scenario is when you can actually have a team of folks that can pull all of their different skills together to make the most of it. So what we are looking to do now, I am going to upload in the chat here, and I'll also put a link to this in Google Drive. Let's see, sorry, I moved it on my desktop here. Sorry, hold on one moment. One thing I'm going to ask you to do is look through the handout as a group and have one person read the prompts. Then if you could identify one thing per group that excited you about your discussion to bring back to the full group, that would be fantastic. And sorry, my computer took a little bit of a nap here. I hope that folks had a good break and got some yummy food or a good stretch. And I should have done that. I just sat here. Okay, there is a Google Doc now in the chat. If folks are able to click on that link to open that up so you have that for your discussion, that would be great. Does anyone need me to upload that as a file instead? If you can just let me know in the chat, I will go ahead and get that for you. Okay, well, it looks like maybe everyone can access that document. And then Sarah is going to help us organize into some groups. And can I ask Sarah that we have folks, we do this for 14 minutes and have everyone come back at 1:15?
Yes, we could do 14 minutes. Just so folks know, I will try to put you into a group with people from your own organization. I'm not sure where everyone is from, and I do know there are a couple of people here from who are the only one from the organization. So won't be perfect, but we'll try to group you. So let me just take a moment to assign folks out. Okay. It's gonna take me a moment here.
That's fine. And just to let folks know how I've broken out this concept of organizational capacity to do data collection efforts, I'm looking at people, and that's within your organization, but also community partners or others external to your org, knowledge, funding, skill sets, and also time. So those are the 5 areas that I'm going to ask people to look at. If you're more interested or more concerned about one of those areas, you are welcome to skip to that section of the discussion. That is fine to move around. If you don't make it through all of those areas, that is completely understandable.
All right, we should be all set. We'll see you at 1:15, Sally.
Yes, let's do that.
Okay.
we will not shut down for this. Sorry. And he's like, well then we won't. Then we're not going to do it. I'm not having my guys out here getting being in dangerous way and all that other shit. Oh man, we went back and forth with their management. They were pricked up and they were like, well, you know, if our guys don't do it, they're not going to do it. And all this other shit. And like, you're like, if we just go to do like that operator or one of these, I think it was one of like, yeah, yeah, they do this one. Yeah, and it was that one that they didn't do. So somebody else do it and all that other shit, and we just there's everybody else in contact. Everybody turned it down for the gate that went up so wide. So we finally talked to them and explained them what our issue is, and they said that they apologized to us and said that those people are gone, they're no longer with them, and all this other shit. Did you explain that right off the bat? Oh yeah. Yeah, I can understand. Yeah, I did. I know exactly what happened.
Nail biter tonight. Sound stress. 24 hours.
Hey, Teddy. How's it going? Not good. You do not like that.
Oh my God. Okay, now I have to go on a call.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Great. Thank you for going through that exercise. If folks wouldn't mind sharing one thing that your group was really excited about, that you were able to talk about that. If you folks wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat, that would be fantastic. I'm going to talk a little bit about how using guides and protocols can really help address issues that folks brought up in the skills assessment that they might want to develop some more tools and skills around. So there are a variety of different guides for focus groups and protocols. I'm going to share several of those, some that we actually developed for the SADI project, but then some that have been developed by some of our partners. And I will share that in the chat. But before doing that, I want to give you kind of my quick list of tips to help you listen through the process. So when I develop my guides and protocols, I add about 5 more things than most people put in their typical guide. First, I make sure I have a clear goal statement. I write in what the staffing plan is for doing the data collection, including what the training is going to look like for those folks. I include the recruitment plan. How are we going to recruit? Are there existing groups and partners that we know have valuable information, and are they invested that we would want to talk to? The timing for it. Are there specific community events or times of year that would be more challenging for recruitment and actually doing the data collection that we want to avoid? And then I would include specific samples of how we're gonna talk about informed consent throughout the process. What does that look like during recruitment? What does that look like for participation in interview? What does it look like throughout focus groups? And then lead into some more traditional things that are typically in a guide or protocol. And that is actually, what are you going to ask? What order are you going to ask it with? How are you going to build rapport? And how are you going to create a safe container for folks to share their experiences and stories and ideas with you? And so that typically includes that building rapport and agreement, but also how you're going to close up and do follow-up with folks about what comes out of their participation, and certainly including in that your data analysis plan. So that's my list of 10 things. What you traditionally see is folks breaking out their guides into 4 different types of questions: those opening and engaging questions, some transitional questions, the key questions that are going to explore the issue that's the heart of your project and your goal, and then those questions that are going to help you conclude and end. Sometimes interviews and focus groups and surveys include demographic questions. They do not have to. I think it's a really important discussion for your teams to have about data equity and thinking about what data equity looks like throughout the process. And hopefully it's a participatory process where you're talking with either staff that are going to be involved as participants in any focus groups or interviews, or community members about what is key demographic information, if any, that should be collected that would add a meaningful information to the data collection efforts. So I'm just gonna put in the chat. There are 2 guides from the SADI project, one for focus groups and one for interviews. And then Morgan Curtis developed a focus group guide with specific examples of questions to ask if your work is focused on your prevention efforts. So I'm going to put those in the chat really quick. And we'll get those out in a resource list to folks as well. So number 1, we started off our time together talking about you have to be really clear about describing your purpose. And that means to me that I'm able to describe it to my mom in very clear terms, that she would understand what I'm trying to do. Certainly you need to be able to understand it within your team, but you need to be able to clearly communicate to your potential participants what you're looking to do. Having that clear staffing plan should include training and support for staff and partners, and including that trauma-informed perspective. That's going to provide space and time for folks to do the proper debrief and working with each other on the process. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we're reducing potential vicarious trauma and how things are set up. And that may be that how you're spacing out doing the work for folks as well, and who you're collaborating with. I want to talk a little bit about recruitment and getting back to this goal of these data collection opportunities are about building relationships. You want to come to this with ethics in mind, putting accountability to the community and or staff as central, that you're going to share ownership and power. And that means sharing the process of potentially creating the questions that are priorities to ask, and how you're going to analyze the data. Have you identified community members that could possibly be part of your data analysis plan and process, where you can be checking the data back actually with participants, that you could do a quick summary saying, these are the themes that we heard, we're sharing them back to you, and ask folks if you got something wrong or if you misinterpreted. Having things in place that are really going to be about sharing the data and who owns it. And then motivating and showing participants that they're valued. This can often mean incentives. It might be a gift card. It might be some other show of appreciation, like sharing food together during a focus group if you're able to meet in person. It may be a lot of different things. So a part of this is being able to make sure that you're connected with your participants to know what makes them feel valued. It might mean that they're able to help present the data in the organization and talk about their experience and what it means to them. It might look different for each individual person, but really important conversations to be having with folks about how you can make sure they understand how valuable their time is, but also how valuable their perspectives are. And ultimately, this gets to this 5th point listed here about have you really been able to talk about how data collected is going to benefit the participants, that you have a clear plan and vision about how organizational change efforts are going to serve either those internal staff you might be collecting data from or those partners or community members. Informed consent and group agreements needing to be an ongoing process, and having that written into your guide. And I will also say, I often say writing, but I could say your guide could be a video that you do, that's shared with your team, that you put together. It doesn't have to be a written document. It can be created in a way that works best for your team. So I don't mean to limit it to the written word. It can definitely be shared in lots of different ways. In developing questions, I mentioned that you want the opening, introduction, transition, some key questions, and some ending questions. I do want to jump into the idea of be ready for follow-ups. This is pretty common that we're using in facilitation or in direct service work, asking if people could say more about that, tell me more, asking for folks to give an example, checking in that you heard something correctly, saying, I think what I heard you say was, and repeating that back to someone. So those are some examples. Again, you'll have these handouts to see if any of these will resonate or be helpful to you. And focusing on listening throughout the process, the key to that is to be open by having open-ended questions, to ask questions slowly, to give room for silence, which we know is so important for folks to be able to formulate ideas, and to not assume and clarify at every moment, and let people tell you what they want you to know. Make sure you're creating space for that. I've included here some examples of how to reduce bias, especially with your questions. Again, you're going to have these examples of how not to have leading questions. I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly because I know we're getting towards the end of our time. How to structure your questions to be neutral, to not ask about multiple things in one question, to focus on one thing at a time, and not to put really value-loaded questions into your interview or focus group design, to really focus on keeping things as open-ended as possible. There's a little bit of science with question order. Start general. Use positive questions before any negative questions. Ask about behavior questions before you get into attitude questions. That's what the research is telling us often works best for folks processing. There are a few things here about tips for note taking. For me personally, when I'm able to, I do ask for permission to record interviews in focus groups. These tips here are mainly meant for the primary interviewer or facilitator. If your role in the partnership is to be the note taker, you would want to be taking verbatim notes as much as possible, especially if you don't have permission to do an audio or video recording. So these are mainly some notes for the interview or facilitator for you to take a look at a later time. And lastly, I'll just say it's important throughout the process to be able to check yourself, check your assumptions, that you're testing out questions with your teammates, with community members, and with potential folks that would be participating, that you're partnering up, that you're getting those reviewers, and that you're conforming any of your analysis, your results with participants, if that's possible to do that. Well, I would hope that you can think about two things today. One is a step that you could take to continue to develop your plan right now, if there's something, an action step you can take. And then longer term, think about how you can come back to this group and how you might be able to support each other as cheerleaders, reviewers, support people, problem solvers, any ways that you might be able to come together as a group. So with that, I'm going to stop and just say, you are all fantastic. You're going to do something amazing with this work. I can't wait to see how it develops in time. And certainly I'm available for help if folks are looking to run some questions by to get some feedback as you're developing an interview protocol, I'm happy to provide some help with that.
Sally, thank you so much. This has really been wonderful. I'm going to borrow from your metaphor and say I really appreciate you have given us so much food for thought, and it will help us start our next steps. Everyone who joined today, thank you so much for taking the time. You know, each of your cohort leads, as we have been in regular communication, will continue to be in communication with all of you. We will be walking through this process with you. We'll be working in collaboration with you to support you. Remember to complete your organizational assessments if you haven't done so already. And this was a really good segue to bring us towards our peer support calls that are scheduled for the week of June 14th, where we'll be able to delve a little bit more into all of this and the next steps that we're going to take as far as community interviews and focus groups. Thank you so much. We will send out all of the materials to you. And for those who are unable to join, you'll also have that along with the recording. Have a wonderful afternoon.